Hey, everybody. We have long been aware of the deeply troubled waters of fundamentalism in the evangelical Christian, Muslim, and Judaic traditions, but an equally insidious form of intolerance and cultural insensitivity, not unsurprisingly rooted in white male privilege, has been festering in the American pagan witchcraft community as well. And tonight, we're going to talk about that. I got out of bed because this was just something I had to get off my chest and couldn't abide any further. I'm Dr. John Michael Salvato, and this is Inner Alchemy After Dark. Alchemy. Hey, and welcome back. Many authors and podcasters have tackled the subject of gatekeeping and witchcraft in the pagan community over the past several years, and they've done so incredibly well. So that's not my intention. I certainly would not have gotten up out of bed for that. But this is a cancer that grows unchecked within the American pagan witchcraft community, especially among what I call the pop culture witches, that I think needs to be checked. Let me go ahead and turn commenting on so I can keep an eye on it. I did not wear my glasses, and so keeping an eye on the comments is going to be kind of tough, particularly with a growing occlusion in the left eye. So if I don't see your comment right away, please know that I will pay attention. I'm really glad that you're here and joining me, for those that are watching us live. Before we dive in, let me thank you in advance for liking and subscribing and telling your friends about this broadcast, sharing it widely on social media. If you think that this will vibe with somebody that you know, we really appreciate that. Tonight's topic is one that's becoming increasingly loud among the pop culture. And I think at this moment, it's something that we have to look at. All you got to do is go take a peek at the Look at Me witches of Instagram, the lead press on culture of the Facebook and TikTok witches, and the world of YouTube covens and magical circles and Wiccan glitterati that identify themselves as witches, and even worse, as somehow being authorities on the topic. And you can see that this is a problem that I think we have to talk about. And so I welcome you guys to join the conversation. I welcome you to weigh in and comment during the show and after. Now, the most telling part, I think, of this phenomenon is that there isn't a single one of these religious fundamentalists over the age of 50. So that tells you that it's likely a generational thing. It's likely something that came out of that culture where everybody who played softball got a participation trophy. Everybody who entered the art contest got a participation trophy. That's a mental illness that exists in a certain generation. And not once have I heard a person of color or a woman make the kind of disgraceful comments that I'm addressing tonight. So I think that also tells you that it's a white privileged male issue. And so it's not surprising that it's becoming louder at this point in time, because we're seeing social injustice being called out. And so those white privileged males are aware that they've been seen. They're aware that they've been exposed, and they're losing relevance in our society with every passing day around the world. So let me just cut to the chase. Nobody has the right to tell another person if they're a legitimate witch or not, period. And nobody, particularly not anyone who lacks the proper academic background or diversity of experience, the proper maturity, spiritual, personal, or physical, has the authority to determine whether somebody's practice is witchcraft or not. That's gatekeeping, and it's bullshit. The first mention of the term witches, this is kind of useful, I think, context. And it comes from my being an anthropologist. It comes from my being a nerd. But the first mention of what we think of when we hear the word witches and witchcraft can be found in the Code of Hammurabi, which is a well-preserved Babylonian text, a code of law from Mesopotamia, dating back to 1754, I think it is, before the Common Era, sometime in the 18th century BCE. And in that code of law, male practitioners of witchcraft are addressed. There's no mention of female practitioners of witchcraft. That doesn't mean that they didn't exist. It means that the law was focused on something specific. And the second of the 282 laws that are written out in the Code of Hammurabi states, if a man charges a man with sorcery and can't prove it, then the person who's charged, who's accused of sorcery, should go to the river and into the river throw themselves, and if the river drowns him, then the accuser shall take the accused witch's house. If the river doesn't drown the man, then he comes out of the river unharmed, and the person who is charged with sorcery is put to death. Now, that's really interesting. Think about that. Now, I kind of paraphrased it too, but I've quoted this often enough that I almost remember it verbatim. But I understand the context, and I think the context is so important. And the word witch, as used by anthropologists, identifies someone who is alleged to practice socially prohibited forms of magic, while sorcerer refers to a person who intentionally practices magic with the intention to harm. So these are both used in something of a pejorative sense. Neither one is sort of a clean way of identifying somebody, and it's never been something that the practitioners themselves called themselves. So these two definitions become one and the same around the time that the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church began twisting and willfully misinterpreting the meaning of the Hebrew term Mekashefa, which is used in the book of Exodus and is often interpreted as a witch. Now, some later interpretations would say poisoner. It literally means a person who utters mystic words. And so that would later be misinterpreted, possibly intentionally, by the Greeks as a pharmakia or a poisoner, because I think the Greeks may very well have understood that the original meaning of that text may not have been clear enough. Not that the word itself was wrong, but that the intention was not clear. It may not have been that the author of Exodus meant to condemn everyone who practiced the craft, but maybe specifically those who practiced the craft in ways that was seen as poisonous or malevolent. Now, we can imagine, if we really apply ourselves, that in the ancient world, those who were identified as practitioners of magic were not, despite what some pop culture figures would like you to believe, simply practicing primitive folk magic or practicing superstitiously. These people in the ancient world were skillful adepts at the magical properties of plants and roots, and their knowledge of nature that was clearly both beneficial and baneful, but they were also clearly, by choice, by matter of the word that was used in Exodus, these were clearly practitioners who understood the mysteries. These were clearly practitioners who possessed what would later become known as Hermetic knowledge. Otherwise, the word used would not have been Mekeshef, because this was about using sacred utterances or mystical utterances. These people knew what they were doing. And so from the 18th century BCE, there were no prescriptions against those who used their skills in ways that were benign or healing. Therefore, we can be really sure that the prescription was never against them being a witch or being a sorcerer. It was against poisoning or bringing harm. And more often than not, the prescription was born out of a misunderstanding of nature and physiology and medicine and science that couldn't understand that sometimes even the best medicine, the best herbs, the best treatment doesn't work. And what I want to bring to everybody's attention tonight is to call to mind or focus on what's missing from these earliest known descriptions of what witches were. And what's missing is religion. Nowhere in the discussions of witchcraft in the ancient world does it talk about practicing any sort of religion. Nowhere does it talk about witches being part of an initiatory mystery tradition. Nowhere does it claim that witches had to participate in the god or goddess cult and worship a god or goddess in any sort of religious cult whatsoever. No, those twisted, ignorant, and childish notions come from one source and one source only, and that is the Roman Church. And so it really drives me nuts. It's tragic that we see the ignorance and baseless accusations of the vile and manipulative Church of Rome, and then later the Church of England, being used by young, privileged white boys and their groupies against those whose practices of witchcraft they don't understand. You know, those whose practice of magic, those privileged little princesses would never be permitted to learn. You see, if you're not part of a culture, you seldom understand much of the cultural nuances of that culture. It shouldn't be that hard to recognize, especially when so many of these witches of Instagram, witches of YouTube, witches of Facebook are smarter than that. They should recognize that. And that's why, despite my having worked with practitioners of voodoo and Santeria and hoodoo and Appalachian root work for 27 years, I'd never attempt to speak with any authority on those traditions. I've written 10 books. None of them are about traditions that I've not been part of. I know when it's time to stay in my own fucking lane and shut up. It's too bad that others don't. But then I'm 57 years old with 5 decades of study and practice in my own tradition. Because while others are out there gatekeeping and minding everybody else's business, I was too busy practicing my craft. So when I get perturbed by Americans claiming to have been born into a hereditary tradition as if that was some sort of pedigree, it's with good reason. Even worse, when I see a total fraud, despite the fact that they're popular and much beloved, who after being caught lying about allegedly being a Gardnerian witch, suddenly changes his tune and says he was raised in an imaginary and non-existent tradition called Svegaria that doesn't exist anywhere in Italy and never has. Or when a roughshod caricature of a sideshow circus gypsy pretends to be the descendant of a celibate gay mystic whose practice of the Italian magical tradition doesn't remotely resemble anything that her own Wicca with Italian herbs and seasonings looks like. I get pissed. And I own that. Now, I also spent 20 years of research into the forms of Italian witchcraft and magical practice that predates the Catholic folk magic and Catholic conjure traditions, and the slightly older syncretic segnatore practices that can be found throughout Italy. So I'm really well versed, both as a practitioner and as an anthropologist, in the grotesque mistakes and misrepresentations made by people like Margaret Murray, and the ways in which the brilliant folklorist Charles Leland may have been unintentionally or intentionally misled so that he would mistake his experience with the practitioners of the pagan religion of Tuscany as being a gathering of witches rather than what it was. And that is a religious sect gathering in the Boschetto, gathering in the Grove, which included as many witches as it may have included bakers and farmers and teachers and housewives and blacksmiths and whatever else existed at that point in time in that Tuscan village. See, sadly, because no neo-pagans stopped to think about the possibilities outside of what they were taught, we have this problem. Sadly, because neo-pagans bought so fully into the origin story that validates their religious devotion, Some of the most beautiful and time-honored 20th century Neo-Pagan religions, the first in history to blend the study of witchcraft with the pagan cult of the goddess. And yeah, I said the first. For the first time in the 20th century, we see people taking the practice of witchcraft and the practice of the old religion and blending them. That didn't exist in the ancient world, in my opinion. There's no evidence that it ever existed in the ancient world. But because these people have to be validated, they buy into those origin myths. And so as a result, these beautiful traditions that arose in the 20th century are being disgraced by people who imagine themselves to be authorities and gatekeepers, apparently, with the authority to declare whether more ancient practices or even newer practices of the arts and sciences, and yes, I said sciences, of witchcraft are legitimately witchcraft. Some of them have even gone so far as to ridicule the simple fact that those who best understand witchcraft, some of the greatest elders that the 20th century has known, but going back much further than that, have recognized that indeed witchcraft is both an art and a science, as proven by the very existence. If these people would shut up and get their ego out of the way and listen and look and pay attention to the facts, it's evidenced by the very fact that the mystery schools that the neo-pagans try to claim a cultural link to was indeed a science. And so it's sad. It's cultural ignorance at its highest, and since such proclamations generally come from those whose experience in one tradition or several ought to have at least taught them to stay in their own fucking lanes, and that reading a book about a different culture, distinctly different from your own or a different tradition, doesn't make you an authority on it. Oh, it's sad. I get it. It's frustrating when we see people that are frauds and charlatans out there, and you want to call them out. I understand that, but that doesn't have to express itself as gatekeeping. You know, enough of this fucking cancel culture. No one would come to these self-proclaimed psychics or witches or divinators unless they bang their own drums and make enough noise to appear special. But the sad part is that no one would come to them just because they don't take the time to bring the respect to their practice. The sad part is often the most fundamentalist voices are good and true and skillful witches who just have their heads up their asses when it comes to gatekeeping and cancel culture, and who are just unwilling to see their white privilege. If they would just shut the fuck up and talk about their tradition, their approach to divination, their path, they could have every bit as many people paying for their services or buying their wares as they're making now by trying to cancel everyone else out. And they generally appear to understand their traditions very well. So I wish we could get through to those people. And let's be clear, these aren't just Wiccan practitioners. These aren't just Alexandrian practitioners. These aren't just Tradcraft practitioners or Dianic cultists. This is across the board. Essentially, wherever rich millennial and Gen X white boys gather, you find this fundamentalism starting to rear its ugly head. And it's time that we call it the fuck out. And yeah, I find it curious when someone tells me that they practice witchcraft without any connection to the old ones. That just doesn't make sense to me. Or what pop culture, which is called the gods and goddesses. I just find it curious. I don't understand it when they say that they want to practice witchcraft, but without any connection to the old ones. Or when they say they don't want to do ancestral work. Or when they say they don't want to do this or they don't want to do that. And yes, I am skeptical when someone tells me that they were self-initiated, because from my perspective, such things don't likely exist any more than the egomaniacal claim that someone got their powers from grandma or from their daddy. They inherited witchcraft from daddy or mommy. I understand that the claims made by people who say such stupid shit are people who are starved for attention, people who are desperate for validation. However, I do realize that some of us are born into families where there are practitioners who are very skilled and who encourage the cultivation of those skills in us when we're younger, so that we have the advantage of support, but we still have to do the work. We still have to put in the effort. We still have to cultivate those skills. I get really twisted when somebody says it's a gift that they have. It's not really a gift. Gifts are given to you unconditionally, or maybe even conditionally. But the craft isn't a gift. The craft is an opening of an awareness that we work on. It's a relationship. It's the result of a relationship with the divine masculine and divine feminine. But I'll never tell somebody who says otherwise that they're not a witch. Why? Because that was a word that was used originally by outsiders to cast aspersions on us against those who practice the craft of the wise, the unnamed path, as well as a word that's used by some of the same outsiders to attack people who didn't even practice our ways, but who might have been eccentric or unkempt, who might have been misunderstood or marginalized for some other reason. It was a word that was used by manipulators and people in power and the criminals of the Roman and Anglican churches to justify the murder of mostly innocent women and a fairly smaller number of men, some of whom were practitioners and some of whom were not. We'll never know, because it was an unjust and criminally motivated rampage. Just as we see on our streets in Portland and Seattle and Chicago, where we see violence being perpetrated against peaceful protesters, we'll never know if any of those people were actually rioters. Most of them were not. And so the word witch is used to justify colonialization. It's used to justify enslavement and racism at every level of society, just like we see happening in our world. And that's why at this moment, it's not acceptable. If anyone has reclaimed the word witch or warlock or sorcerer or strega, they have my respect. I don't have a right to tell them that what they're practicing is not witchcraft. Now, I can't imagine practicing my craft without the type of initiation that exists in my culture, which has none of the formality, none of the pomp and circumstances of the initiations found in the Neo-Pagan tradition, where initiation is much more liturgical and this beautiful ritual and production. But the initiations in my tradition predate their traditions by thousands of years, according to legend, at least by hundreds of years. But simply because I can't imagine entering or stepping onto the path without some sort of initiation doesn't mean it can't be done, or that it hasn't been done, for all I know. I can't imagine not working with the spirits, the principalities and powers that we work with in my tradition, but that doesn't mean that those who don't aren't witches, or that their practice isn't witchcraft. And here's the message, loud and clear, and with small words for the privileged white boys out there. Those of us who practice and who embrace a path that doesn't resemble your racist white privilege neo-paganism don't really give a fuck whether you think that what we practice can be called witchcraft or folk magic or stregoneria or fatuchiere or sorcery, because we got the validation we needed when we were children. And if we didn't, we've already done the work with our therapist to be okay with who we are. So your opinion doesn't matter. And as a result, we also understand that witchcraft devoid of social justice is impotent. And so we call you out because we want you to know that you've been seen, not because we want to condemn you. We call you out because you can do better. We call you out because you can be better, because you are better. And you will not pick on those who might be easily intimidated by your presence on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or YouTube on our watch. Not in our world. Got it? Get it? good.
The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions,
calling us always to treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves.
Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures.
To dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there.
To honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being.
Treating everybody without exception.
With absolute justice, equity, and respect.
It is also necessary in both public and private life.
To refrain consistently and empathically from inflicting pain.
To act or speak violently out of spite, chauvinism, or self-interest.
To impoverish, exploit, or deny basic rights to anybody.
And to incite hatred by denigrating others, even our enemies.
Is a denial of our common humanity.
We acknowledge that we have failed to live compassionately.
And that some have even increased the sum of human misery in the name of religion.
We therefore call upon all men and women to restore compassion
to the center of morality and religion.
To return to the ancient principle
that any interpretation of scripture
that breeds violence,
hatred, or disdain
is illegitimate.
To ensure that youth are given accurate and respectful information
about other traditions, religions, and cultures.
To encourage a positive appreciation of cultural
and religious diversity.
To cultivate
an informed empathy
with the suffering of all human beings,
even those
regarded as enemies.
We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world.
Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness.
Compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries.
Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential for human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity.
It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable in the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community.